how do we feel about having Michael? And I want to also name, maybe folks haven't been with the group when we've had an author with us before. So you can even talk about how that was, you know, like chatting with an author, if that was one of your first times. If you're a pro at this and a member of the Literary Freedom Project, then you already know you've had an opportunity to speak with authors before. You know, start from there, and then we can also get specific into sort of personality and what you thought he was like. So I'm so excited to hear what folks thought.
Hey.
Hey.
I'll start. I just wanted to say that I felt a little bit disappointed by the end of the book. I kind of had to read it pretty quickly. But I guess I felt kind of disappointed because I don't know what I was expecting, if I was expecting, and I think we touched upon this in the beginning of our discussions, that what would be the end result of it. But I didn't expect the end result to be, I'm still broke. I'm still trying to buy or write books to make money. I don't know, I just kind of felt that way. And even I really enjoyed seeing him last week. I just don't know what I was expecting. I think he's great. He was a nice guy, and really down to earth personality. I don't know. I felt like, gosh, is this what I almost felt compelled to say he's writing his books just to make ends meet.
Right.
In order to pay bills.
So did you feel like that sense of hope maybe, or no, is what you're
naming? Yeah, I did feel a sort of sense of a hope. Not so much like, let's say, Roxane Gay's book Hunger. Like you start out and say, this is going to be a book of a heavy woman, and then by the end of the book, she already forewarns us. This is not a weight loss story, success story, which it's out there, you put it out there and you're like, oh, okay, whatever. Like I wasn't really expecting it. But for him, I don't know what I expected. By the end of the book, I don't think I expected the same thing. Like, oh, I'm still paying this debt off. And I mean, of course, it's not going to take a year or months. I mean, you know, to pay off, it's going to take several years. I guess I just expected something else or something a little bit more.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you.
I understand that, and I myself felt kind of that way. I have to admit, I was a little, not disappointed. I felt sad. This is a harsh reality.
Yeah, I think that's a nice word too.
Yeah, because the truth is, I'm going to tell you, I know lawyers and doctors who are still paying back their loans. I know professional people who 20 years later, you're not gonna believe this, okay? I have a friend, he's a lawyer. It's been 20 years, he's still paying back his student loan. And it's a harsh reality of because remember something else, student loan is the easiest loan that a person can actually get. And it's a whole bureaucratic system within itself. I understand that someone told me that many of these universities and colleges have even networks with these banks. And some of them even get commission and everything for how many students they get to do these deals with them. Okay, but the thing about these loans is that there is no guarantee. The loan doesn't say even if you don't get a job, you still have to kind of pay it. It's like you're stuck. And I know a friend, I have a friend that in her second year of college, she had a family emergency. So she had to drop out, and she got real stuck because it took her a while before even going back to get her degree. But the problem is that she had a hard time she had a family emergency, okay? The loan does not say if you have any situation, you don't have to pay it, okay? She's stuck 30 years later with that loan still. So, I agree with what is being said. Yeah, I felt sad also because I felt that, wow, a person should never be stuck like that. But I'm understanding the reality, the harsh reality of something that, believe it or not, no one even wants to talk about, because then a lot of these professionals are even embarrassed. Okay? These lawyers and doctors are too embarrassed to come out and tell you, but listen, I know, look, I have a friend, he's a doctor, and he does all kind of clinical on the side jobs with his medical degree. And he's trying to write articles too about different kind of medical situations. He's doing everything he can do to bring in that extra income in order to pay back that loan from some 10 years ago. And because he took out a big chunk to finishing medical school, he had to take out a pretty big, it's a pretty big chunk that he took out in medical school, okay? It's been 10 years later, and he's been doing every single kind of little medical thing that he gives medical lectures. He gives little, he goes to the side clinics and offers to sign your gym thing for $20. You know, he'll take your blood pressure for you and listen to your heartbeat for then charges $20. But I'm just giving you an example of this, a doctor doing everything he can do to try to some 20 years later. Could you believe that? I mean, folks, it's been 20 years and he's a doctor. He is a doctor. He's still paying back his loan.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Can you believe that?
Yeah, I absolutely do believe it. I can believe it. Maybe also because I'm of the generation where we're clear that the student loan is a business, that a predatory business, you know, but at the same time, I think most folks who don't come from like financially, I can't even say financially sound families. It's more like financially prosperous families. Those are the only people that can really afford college. I think even if you come from a standard middle class home, I don't necessarily think you can afford college. But when you choose a profession like a doctor or a lawyer, where you have to invest, as RG is naming, decades worth of education, oftentimes you then spend decades trying to pay that back, right?
One exception I take, Barbara, is that I don't know if it's a bad thing that he is writing to make money. I think that's what you said. And, you know, he became a writer, and writers deserve to make money. You know, he's writing within his area of focus. He's not, I don't want to say anything crazy, but, you know, he's not writing pornography, you know, things that are outside of, you know, what he does with his vocation, at least, you know, the focus of his writing. Yeah, he's a writer. Writers should make money.
In fact, he's, sorry.
Go ahead, Linda.
I was going to say, in fact, he's very fortunate, and he mentions it in the book, that he is actually working at his craft. Mm-hmm. Many people who find themselves in his situation end up walking away from their original dream because they can't afford to stay in it just to make the student payments. So he's doing what he set out to do. I don't really see how that's any different than any of us making money at whatever, you know, whatever we set out to do.
I agree. I don't know, it's fair for me to say I agree to disagree, but it is. I understand. Absolutely. I do understand that, and Ms. Linda, you're right. It's no different from like how we feel, right? Like some people are working and they hate their jobs, but they need a salary, so they work. I think that maybe I'm seeing being a writer a little bit differently, and I don't know why. I'm just gonna say what I'm saying, how I feel. I feel like writing is more like the joy of it. And for some reason, I don't know why, I felt by the end of the book and throughout the book, I didn't feel like he was so happy. I didn't feel like he was 100% happy that he has to write in order to get paid to pay these crazy amount of bills. That's how I feel. But I do understand what you and Ron are saying. I really do understand that point. kind of feel like I wish that he was happier. Maybe that's what RJ was saying about feeling sad. I don't know. Maybe that's what I felt. Maybe it wasn't disappointed. Maybe I was sad for him that I didn't feel. And this could be absolutely completely wrong. Like he could be the happiest person on the planet, but he didn't perceive to be. That's how I guess how I felt about it.
I really do appreciate all the things that y'all are naming, particularly because Barbara, when I hear what everyone's saying and what you're saying now, I think about the trajectory of storytelling, right? Especially when it comes to personal memoir like this. We often, as the reader, maybe even as the writer, let's talk about it. There's like subconscious expectation that like you see this like growth of character through the things they've learned, but very much so in Arceneaux's tone in this book. And I happen to think that it's an intentional choice. It's this idea that like, no, like this is, and pardon my language, right? Here we go. This is fucked up. So I'm going to navigate this as best as I can using self-deprecating humor, actual humor, you know, honesty, transparency, right? I'm going to navigate it with these tools. And we as the reader are like, oh, okay, I wonder where we're going to end up here, which is why I did. Thank you, Barbara, for naming, because I did ask that question in the beginning of our sessions. Like, what is our expectation, the trajectory of growth in this character? Let's also take a moment to examine as a group, a lot of the main characters that we've been looking at, or the main focus we've been looking at in the last couple of books, have kind of had this growth of this personal growth within whatever part of their story that we've been allowed to latch onto. Does that make sense? Am I making sense? So I think that this is good because I think being disappointed in a story that doesn't take you along for that ride of growth is okay. And I think naming that like, oh, this story didn't end anywhere. The author feels the same way they started, but I'm happy to be along for the ride because they're humorous and charming and whatever is also okay. You know what I mean? Like these are two really distinctive ways of telling one's own vulnerability, trauma, humor, you know what I mean? And I'm almost happy that you're naming, I'm not almost happy, I'm ecstatic. I'm happy that you're naming this, Barbara, and I almost wish this concept could have came to us before today so that we could have spoken with Arceneaux about it, because I think it's important.
So when you were saying that, I thought to myself, before you just said that, I said, if I would have read the rest of the book and I saw him today, would I have asked him my question? I guess my questions are a little bit more personal, but I don't like doing that because, you know, personal questions are personal questions, even though Ron says, if it's in the book, it's up for grabs.
Right.
But me personally, I feel like my simple questions are you happy? But is that a real question? Like, would you really ask someone that,
Right.
you know, and are they going to tell you the truth? Of
Right.
course, we're on this platform. Everyone's going to be like, yeah, I'm excited. I'm happy
Right.
and whatever. But am I going to really share what's deep down inside?
Right. And I'm going to tell you something right now. I think because of like exactly what you're naming, wanting to like not be the person that doesn't have boundaries, right? When you ask that question, as Ron says, pull it back to the book. From where I am as the reader in your story, I've gotten to this point, and this is the sentiment. By the time we end this, where you are here, are you happy when you write this, when you're here? You know, maybe you don't got to ask about what they're doing right now because they're not even with us for how they're feeling right now. They're with us for how he was feeling in 2019. Pardon me if that's not the year, but whatever the year is that he wrote the book. You understand what I'm saying? So I would always, for everyone, Barbara, that's an amazing point. And I would always name that, yes, we want to respect folks and their boundaries, especially when folks are naming, here are all my identities and everything I have to deal with, right? We don't want to just surpass that because it's whatever information we're seeking is out there. But bringing it back to their work always, I find 9 times out of 10 makes the author feel like, oh, no problem, Barbara. Let me tell you exactly how I felt at that time. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that struck me as far as his happiness is in one of the later chapters, how he talks about his mother or the potential violence and how he would have reacted to that violence. I mean, as a side, I thought that the book was poorly packaged. It presents and marketed, it presents as though it is going to be about, and he kind of touched on this last week.
Yeah.
It presents as though it's going to be like this financial, you know, how to or buyer beware, you know, kind of book. And he's really talking about his life and his family. And I think that if they had added maybe just like a subtitle to the title, it may have changed how we consume the book. Because going into it, they only present it as though it will be this financial memoir, when it's really a personal memoir that, you know, finances, you know, influence, you know, what's going on in his life, of course, and he's starting from there. But like his relationship with his parents or his relationship with his lovers, yeah, I mean, you know, money is money. It's everywhere. It kind of like weaves itself through everything. But those are tales he's telling that aren't really deeply connected to his financial woes of, you know, going to college and getting into debt. At least that's how I took it. Like if they had just put a subtitle, you know, I don't want to die poor and I don't know. Live
In
rich.
other
Yeah,
words,
Ron,
other
that-
worries in my life. I don't want to die poor in other worries in my life.
Yeah.
But no, I understand. I hear what you're saying.
That's really interesting, Ron, that whole thing about finances and personal, that there's nothing more personal than finances.
Mhm.
You know, so many folks, I think, and I appreciated how Michael shared those very personal things, because it is deeply connected to the money. You know, what kind of home you're in, can you afford food that day? I mean, you know, those of us we're from different backgrounds, but I when I was listening to him, I'm like, yep, I hear you, my brother, because it's personal. It does. When we grew up with our folks, and whatever relationship folks had with money and finances, that it's trickled down, right? They were taught that. So it's very personal, like viscerally so personal, I think. But at the same time, you know, publishing, they perhaps said, we're going to leave that title just like that to pull people in, with people thinking it was going to be something else, and it was that, and then a whole lot more something else. So there's so many different ways, I think, to look at it. And when folks are writing books and telling stories, they're evolving and growing every single day into the day they die, whatever day or year that is. So I'm always fascinated. I get so into what they're writing because they're people and life happens, and you know, growth is a very personal thing too, much like finances.
Speaking of, what are other parts of this last final bit that we had to finish reading that have stood out to you? You know, Ron, people have named like maybe that sense of joy, or what I call the trajectory of growth, right? Ron has named also these other stories standing out to him. It doesn't feel like the gel is as much there. What else is standing out to folks? What else has stood out?
I feel like as I kind of walked into the end of the text, I came to this place where like I maybe like realized he's calling not for like an abolition of capitalism, but like how to survive capitalism, or how he's figured out best to survive capitalism. So like it made me even revisit my question that I asked last week of like he's not talking about, like, he doesn't think it's good, he's not promoting capitalism, but he's not talking about getting rid of it or doing away with it. He's talking about the ills of it, and like how it's so pervasive, and how he's just doing his best. And so like I feel like that's kind of where I walked. So maybe like I didn't walk away with like a lot of hope, but that's my own like political leanings, I think, that's in there, where I was just like, you know, like, yes, you have to survive it, but like I maybe I don't know, there isn't like a real critique of like its existence in that way.
Absolutely. Thank you. Especially because I think he clarified even more for us. To me now, I feel like it's real poetic, the metaphors around the housewives and you know, the reality of our references because what he had said in that conversation we had was around that those folks create a sense of accessibility for folks that don't understand even how gross one can live within like capitalism and freedom in capitalism. You know what I mean? Like it's gross the way these people live. And these are sort of the examples that he's using to talk about his own worries and navigating capitalism, which look completely different. It's gross in a completely different way. So I do really appreciate that a lot, Alyssa. I think it's spot on. What else stood out to folks? Is he as funny toward the end? Or are you sort of like, all right,
He's
Ron
not
is saying
funny.
no. Ron, what do you think?
He didn't
No.
feel funny at all at the end. I mean, he tells the story of his mother. He tells the story of getting insurance before Obamacare.
Mm-hmm.
He tells the story of being in a relationship with a guy he really liked, which had a little bit of humor in it, but you knew it was going to end by the way he kind of set it up. Yeah, it just felt like he had exhausted all of his humor and just really wanted to. It almost felt like he was, what do you call that when you make an admission, not just get something off your chest, there's not more than a confession,
Yeah.
but I can't, what was that, Paul?
No, I'm trying to figure out what
Yeah,
the word.
I can't remember what the word, like cathartic kind of
Yes.
release. It felt
Especially
more
with his
like that,
mom.
less humorous. I'm sorry, go ahead, Linda.
No, I was just saying, especially with his mother, when
Yeah.
he begins by talking about how mean she is and
Mhm.
their relationship and how they simmer, they're like about beating people up. I thought that was sort of, that could have gone in a whole nother direction for a whole nother book itself to me. He seemed to be very raw and honest there.
The mother and the father could be a separate book altogether,
Right.
like that relationship.
Right. So to further this, my other question then is, how do y'all feel about that choice with the book ending sort of, maybe some people feel like out of nowhere, but the book sort of ending in like this tone of more vulnerability is what it seems like to me, but in a less light way. How do people feel about that choice, given that it started off differently? Also, can you see why a decision like that can lead a reader, Barbara, I'm not singling you out, you're just great for my example right now, can lead a reader to sort of where Barbara is at, and the idea of like, but wait a minute. So how are you now that you've said all this to me, and now what am I supposed to walk away with beside just your story with this? You know, can you see how a reader may feel that way? But I heard someone talking. No.
I just felt when you asked the question before that one and you were like, well, you did that thing, I said to myself, that's exactly how I felt. Yeah. I don't feel like there was an ending to the book. I felt like he could have went on, to be honest. I felt like he probably had a whole bunch of more stuff, more vulnerable things to say, or more things. Somebody used this word in the few weeks that we were discussing. It was more like I don't remember, I don't even want to misquote anybody, but it was more like a rant.
Yeah.
His book was more like a rant. I don't know who said it, but I remember that word. And that's how I felt. Like he was just kind of ranting, even though it was his truth, and no one could get mad about presenting their truth the way they want to present it. But I felt like by the end of the book, I still felt like there could have been 10, 15 more chapters, and he still probably had more to say, or could have had more to say. It didn't feel like there was a true, real ending. Maybe that's what essays are. I don't know if I've ever read a book like that before. So a memoir, but kind of like, I don't know if it was just like essay form. I'm not sure.
No, I definitely understand what you mean. And we did read the Tarana Burke, Brene Brown. Like that's like a great example.
Yeah.
That
Right.
probably felt more thematic and more like in a sort of, I don't want to say trajectory necessarily, but it had like a path. Like you kind of felt like, okay, and we're wrapping like these heavy topics. So I don't think that's wrong at all. I'm also thinking about how last week Michael named for us that if Michael had the chance, he probably, there are so many edits he was naming. Like, I think sometimes even in the conversation, if I were to go back and look at the recording, there are times that we talk about like certain writings or certain portions of the book, and you can see in his face kind of like this idea that like, if he can do it differently, he would. And he talks about his next book being cleaner. I think that was a term he used, like me, and I don't meant like of content. I think more like a path, more of a trajectory, more of like a beginning, middle, end, perhaps. And it could be in essay form. It can be through different forms of his life, but we as the reader can hit those points. You know what I mean? I hope that's what it sort of seemed like he was alluding to, as well as like creating a show and all those other cool projects. Do people agree? Like, am I bugging? Did you get this sense as well that like he feels like his project is sloppy a little?
I think maybe at the end, maybe there could have been something added, like some kind of solution maybe, or some kind of idea. I mean, for example, I've heard of like different types of maybe forgiveness loan programs, or maybe add something that a student could do, or a person in general, so that they don't fall into that bind.
But what if he doesn't know that?
And he does critique that. Go ahead, Alyssa.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, like, I almost liked the mess. Like, okay, like completely candid, I have student loan debt, and I just felt like, I don't know, like I was just like, this messiness relates to the messiness that I feel. Like, I'm not in a place of like finality. There's no conclusion. There's like no bow to put on the package. And so I wonder if, like, I guess my question to like hearing the conversation, I wonder if like messiness can ever be intentional. Like maybe it was supposed to be in part a messy project. I don't know. Like, I just feel like even like the nature of student loan debt, a lot of it like resonated with me around that. And just, like there's different proposals for student loans and like how to absolve them. But like what is the solution? And is that something that is connecting to kind of maybe the emotional messiness and just the messiness of the feeling of the book?
Right. I definitely agree with you. I think what you're saying speaks to the conversation that RJ's naming. RJ's naming, like, well, maybe perhaps there could have been some sort of solution. And what I hear you naming is like, well, I don't even know I don't think the solution is, I don't think this book is meant to necessarily have that solution, right? But as to the messiness, I want to say that I do appreciate that poetic connection you're making around how like, this shit is messy. So I appreciate this being everywhere. And I think also, again, when we talk about like that growth, that trajectory of growth, it doesn't have to hit like an end point. Like it doesn't have to be from point A to point C. But I think as the reader, you kind of want to come to a conclusion with the author. And maybe sometimes messiness makes you feel like, wait a minute, don't go. There's so much more. You know what I mean? Like, way to wrap that.
I wonder also if on a personal level, I mean, okay, his father was an alcoholic. Okay, and his mom was someone who I get the feeling was like very strict with him, like she had that colonial. She was a Haitian Catholic. Okay, so I'm trying to read between the lines there to understand what his personal situation is. So she's like trying to be real strict with him and everything, but in the meantime, she really couldn't help him. Okay, and he really had no choice. A lot of people who go to college are stuck like that because the truth is that the university upper education was meant for the elitist person, for those who come from the well-to-do families. And the fact is, everybody is a book like this has to hit on a personal level. I remember when I was in college, I worked 2, 3 full-time jobs at one time. I knew where every single couch was at because every single nap that I could take in between, I took when I was in college, okay? All right, any little wink of my eyes that I could get, and that's the only way I was able to graduate without taking a student loan. And I know that a regular person cannot do that. Okay, hold 2 jobs at one time and go to school full time, and after a while, I was every little corner with every little chair that I could find, you would find me napping after a while. I did graduate with no debts. Yes, I did, but boy, it was hard. It was, and I know the regular person isn't going to do that. Okay.
Archie, can we name something? Can we name something though? Also, and I don't, and this is not a, this is, I always get nervous as we're being recorded, but because I really do respect Arceneaux's journey and thus what they've been able to share so far. But I want to name what you're saying. Your experience is actually an even more emphasized version of the conversation that Arceneaux's trying to have, because the reality is Arceneaux is a couple of years older than me and of the generation where he was able to work via writing. And it's different. I'm not saying you don't make a ton of money, but it's not that. The physicality, even of what you're naming, right? The traveling, the buses, all of that is labor that we actually don't, it's not the same as him having to write and submit and being nervous about like his own fears. So I just want to name even that, like, even in you naming your personal story, it gives us as a, you know, we're not reading, we're listening to you, but as the listener, as the reader, as the people consuming your story, it gives us sort of a trajectory of growth, because we're like, oh, wow, RG had to like do all of these other things in order to get to this point. And to Barbara's point slightly earlier, Barbara, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, Arceneaux didn't do that with us. He kind of just left us. Even in that short story you told us, you've given us sort of like a bam, bam, bam. We are in the journey with you, and we are seeing the growth, and we've come to like the conclusion, which is you were able to do that, and not many people could do that. And like, that shit is not easy, and it essentially is unfair, and it sucks, and it's racist. But Arceneaux doesn't even fully give us that without giving us all of these other caveats as well, right? Like what Ron mentioned, a lot prior to this ending part, a lot of the relationships around housewives and like personal relationships and like partnership, right? I remember folks in the beginning of our session for this book were like, oh, I'm a little uncomfortable because he's over here talking about trying to get with this other person. You know what I mean? And I thought this was a book about money. I remember that. I don't know if other folks remember, but I remember that being part of our conversation. So just naming that, as the reader, we don't really get to rest and say, okay, well, this is what I take away from it. And even in the 2 seconds that you told your story, we were able to pull a resolute from that. Am I making sense, y'all? Because I don't know if it's too deep, but I really do feel like that is, if we're going to say there's a void here, I'm choosing my words carefully, because again, similar to Alyssa, I'm like, yeah, I'm here for the mess. If there's a void here, is that maybe we don't necessarily walk away with that like resolution, not solution, but resolution, right? Like this idea of like, oh, here's the thing I'm taking from this book with me. And maybe that's the point. So y'all are really brilliant. Are other things coming up for folks?
And there's
Paula?
no reason that the book has to end cleanly. I mean, there's no rules around that. So,
Agreed.
You know what I mean? It can end messy. I mean, it's a messy, like almost all the stories are kind of messy. So I'm sorry, Paul, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. I'll actually sort of begin where you just sort of mentioned, which is the end, because there's this book, I sort of agree with Alyssa. I mean, I think that there's something, I think there's something incredibly brave about this book. And actually the ending was, I really struck me. I was listening to the ending. So and when I got to it, I immediately recognized it as, and I may be wrong here, but it sounded to me like something that you do at, the students often do it at the end of a course, which is they do a letter to themselves, a letter to their past selves, a letter to their future selves. And that he's giving advice at the very on page 236, 237, but it's kind of like a letter to my past self in the form of advice to people, you know, who are thinking of his path. And that's what, as we've been talking about this, I've been thinking about the issue of sort of genre, like two things. One is that a lot of these began as blogs, and he said, especially with some of the more powerful ones, like the one where he's addressing his mom, he told us last week that actually started as a blog. And so he's writing a lot of things in sort of multimedia format, but then he pulls them together for a book. And I wonder if we have different expectations for a book than we would if we're reading someone's blog. If we were reading someone's blog every week, we'd sort of say, okay, this is now, this is tomorrow, this is the next day. We'd sort of think, okay, interesting. but reading in a book was sort of like, well, this is kind of like a memoir, but it's also kind of like separate essays, and it's also kind of informal in a way that we don't really expect. And I think that he is brave in letting us see that, because I think a lot of writers would keep this as a blog, and then they'd wait to have a book that is like the book that he's thinking of doing next.
Like a
The book that's a polished book that's meant to be a book. And he's letting us see this interim phase. And part of the reason he's letting us see this interim phase is because he needs to make money. And I think the most amazing thing that sort of impressed me about him all the way through is it is unbelievably hard to make money as a solo writer. Like, he's picked the hardest thing to do. I know lots and lots of writers, and I don't know many who are brave enough not to have not a side gig, a main gig, teaching or journalism or whatever it is that they're doing, and then figuring out how to write doing that. And he's going, and his friend who he admired, he ended saying, I really admired you because you were so much braver than me. And I think his friend was right. He's super brave, and he's living the consequences of that bravery, not only letting us see this book, which is, I think, sort of betwixt in between genres and also where you might read it online or in a book, but also that he is just sticking with writing when everyone knows that's practically impossible to do, only writing early in your career. And so I don't know what I think about the whole thing as a whole, but I just think it's brave and kind of unique in that, so.
I really, really appreciate that, Paula. Thank you. I think the idea, yes, naming the bravery and admiring in that, but for me, what you just said, what struck me is the idea of that maybe the story told as a book in this format wouldn't hit, or we wouldn't be talking about whether it hits or not if it was in a blog format or even a podcast, where, don't you hate when people call things unnecessarily short, like pod, like just say podcast, dude, like it's not that hard. Anyway, like in a podcast, when you're listening to someone tell stories or listening to someone give a narrative every week, right? Then maybe something like this would be awesome because you're like, oh, okay, we're like kind of all over the place in that journey. So that struck me. Thank you. In my last session for 2 months, I'm going to give you my gem because I love to give gems. You got it, Paula. Anything else coming up for folks, or maybe something that was already said? Yeah, Barbara.
I agree with Paula. I also kind of felt like instead of a blog, and I had mentioned this to him last week, I felt they were almost like journal entries, little snippets of like journal entries, like personal journal entries. But I think he responded that he's never done a journal before. So I was like, really? I mean, I don't know. These pages appear to me like journals, but I don't know. Maybe it is kind of like Paula said, maybe it is kind of like a blog kind of feel to it. And I can also respect what Alyssa said about the messiness. Sometimes you have to see other people's different perspectives. Maybe with her sharing her personal story, you can appreciate the fact that, oh, maybe there are just messy things going on, and he doesn't want there to be any kind of organization. He wants to give it to us as messy as he feels it. The other thing that Margie said that you kind of touched upon, Paula, was the fact that she gave us a small snippet of her life and or her college part of it. And immediately I could visualize it. I could take it back to my college days. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm totally understanding that. I totally see it. 1, 2, 3. And it doesn't have to be so organized. It just has to give me some kind of sense, like something. But he took me from the housewives to him having sex or doing this to, like, in my mind, I was like, wait a minute, where am I now? Okay, hold on. And the only really good thing about that is that I felt like I wasn't ever lost. Like I felt like, oh, okay, this chapter is this chapter. And I didn't have to remember so much the other chapters. When you're reading like a full book and you're like, oh my God, what was that? What where did I end up? I felt like, oh, okay, well, I kind of didn't miss anything. He's just going to bring me right up to date. He did this and he was, so that's kind of my intake about that.
I love that.
No,
Also
you
very
know,
much like reality TV.
you know what's funny is that I know this is funny. When I was in college, I knew where every single lounge was at, and I knew every single place that had a couch or sofa in it. Okay, and I knew every single place where I could go take a nap back when I was in college.
That's how I feel now.
Which is amazing. So it was funny because I remember when I graduated, somebody asked me, what were some of the best things you did? What were some of your best experiences? You know, when you graduate, sometimes the student newspaper wants to know what has a seat. And I had to think hard because I couldn't say my best experience was sleeping. Okay, I couldn't say. But some of the best naps I had were in some of those lounges.
Right. What else was I gonna name? Oh, yep.
I said he does have an interesting, like it just feels like he and his father, that's just a book. That's almost a novel and a book and nonfiction together, because you get a sense that it was filled with angst, but he doesn't go as deep. I mean, it's a book of essays and it's not about him and his father, but there's nothing good said about his father. I mean, you know, a couple things here and there, but even those good things come out of bad things, you know, and that feels like a really, again, I don't want to rewrite his book or write his book, but that feels like a really interesting book and just an interesting dynamic of him being this queer, you know, young man when he was growing up in the South, and having this father who seemed almost the opposite of that. And, you know, and on top of that, the potential violence that sort of revolved around, and the way he treated the mom also, which Arceneaux touches on later on in the book. That every time he mentioned his father, I felt like I sat up and I wanted to, you know, reread that part and, you know, make sure I didn't miss anything.
I agree. The parts about his parents, to me, when he gets into the personal things outside of his fear of finances or his vulnerability around finances, seemed the most concise writing to me throughout the entire book. But every time he writes about his parents, I'm like, yeah. But I also want to name that it doesn't feel like, it does feel like there's tension there. This is just my opinion. I'm naming my opinion. It doesn't feel like there's tension there. It feels like perhaps though, I mean, sorry, I'm saying this wrong. It feels like there's a tremendous amount of tension there when it comes to the relationship with his parents. And I don't know if I feel like there is a book there yet, only because of the conversation we had with him last week, because he's still actively in his body. It's, y'all know somatic theory. I just learned this. So like, you know, and if you know it, you are genius. Somatic theory, and I'm going to mess it up right now probably, is the idea that like you take a moment to like feel the things that are being said to you or happening to you at one time. And like, it is recommended that we all practice somatic theory. And I saw when we were talking about his parents, the somatic feeling through his body, like I saw it. And it's not something that's processed yet. It's something that still needs a lot of work through. Even in like the transparency and the fluidness with us is the only time where like Arceneaux was like, you know, where Arceneaux could have said that shit is a hot mess, right? Like we are actually the group for that, for an author to say, you know, for an author to speak in that way. And instead he was just like, it, you know, I remember the notion is just like, it's going to take its time. It is what it is, you know, and I'm going to move in that. So I wonder, while that tension is vivid and I feel it and it's palatable, I wonder if the takeaways or the thoughts of a book are there. You know, it seems like a lot of that processing as an adult is still happening for Arceneaux. I wonder maybe if in 10 years, what that book would be like, you know what I mean, as opposed to maybe the book now. And I also just want to say, Alyssa, this is a great point. Alyssa agrees with you, Ron, when you were speaking, and said, yes, even his essay about his mother sometimes almost centers his father. Alyssa, I don't know if you want to speak to that or, you know, but that's that's an amazing point.
Yeah, no, I was like, even like when the essay first started, he started talking about like not wanting to be his father. And yeah, I just felt like in the beginning, I was like, isn't this supposed to be almost like a letter? Like it almost read as like a letter to his mother. It was directly addressed to her, which was also like, it goes to what you were saying earlier, Paula, about, you know, the tone, the emotional tone of the book changes towards the end. And even like the intimacy is increased with the vulnerability of like this, we're like being let into this direct letter or conversation between him and his mom. But it starts off with him like talking about his dad, which kind of like tripped me up a little bit. And it does shift towards the end of the essay, and he starts to like talk more about her. But for like half of the essay, I'm getting a sense of like his dad. Like it threw me off a bit.
Yep. And I want to name that Paula agrees in a sentence, and just I had to read the essay after Paula, not me. It's funny when I say I, but I'm not talking about me. I had to read the essay after I listened to it because I kept thinking you was father, not mother, confusingly. So it's like the same idea of, again, and that's why I named too that his parent, it seems like just along the themes of everything we've named tonight, like a book about his parents in this moment, presumably just going based off what we're reading, would feel a lot like, I don't have any takeaways necessarily, but here's like a bunch of thoughts and shit about my parents, you know? And I wonder if we're naming that that's the sort of tone we're getting, is that the book we're interested in about his parents? Or are we interested in a book that maybe goes along the lines of, again, I'm going to reference Barbara, right? Around the idea of like, this is the trajectory of growth as I navigate my parents, you know? And I guess that question really is probably for you, Ron, because you were like, oh, I want to see his parents in a book. Which sort of book would that be?
That's a good question. It has to be an autobiography.
Right. I know you don't even like him.
I think it would have to be fiction, because I don't think he could do like I'm sorry, I don't think he could do it in his own voice. It's too raw. Well, it is too raw.
Yeah, it's too raw now. I don't think he can do it now, but I think he referenced being in therapy. It might be 20 years from now when we finally get the book, but there's definitely, you know, a book there, because he only, I mean, you know, rightly so. This is the context of the book is really starting in college and the debt you incur when you go to college. But there is a lot going on when he is a young person, you know, whether the types of friends he has or doesn't have. Later on in the book, he makes reference to dating women or girls for, you know, a brief moment. That's a whole thing. And before just sort of deciding, hey, I'm into guys and that's it. Something funny he says is like, the custom of men paying for everything is a heterosexual thing that he wants to get rid of. Because if you think about it, like, you know, when two men go out, like who is sort of, you know, taking that, I'll call it a responsibility and not a burden.
But you know something, Ron? Okay, I'll tell you one thing that I did. I went ahead and read his first book, I Can't Date Jesus.
Okay.
And that's what made me understand this book so much. Okay, and that's what I did. I went ahead, and he does talk about a lot of what you just said in I Can't Date Jesus. And I understand his relation with his mom. In that book, he describes what happened when he came out and told his mom what his real identity is. And she wasn't very nice to him. As a matter of fact, I don't think she ever really accepted it. Because he talks about those things in that book. And I know, okay, I don't want to be unfair here, but yes, I read his book, I Can't Date Jesus. I went ahead and read that and that's what made me understand more of his personal side. With this book, I Don't Want to Die Poor. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
okay?
And we
Unfair.
also,
That's not unfair. Why, let me take a second. Why would
I
you?
know a lot of people here probably didn't read the first book, but one thing that, you know, when it comes to authors and writers seem to many times have a sequence, and they seem to, like, when they write one particular thing, they kind of move on to the next phase of their writing. You see what and I know a lot of people here maybe didn't read his first book because we're dealing with this title, I Don't Want to Die Poor. But I'll tell you what, if you really want, if you get a chance, go ahead and read the first book, I Can't Date Jesus. You know, because that's what made me understand him from a more personal level, was his first book.
yeah. And we also have to acknowledge that his mother's Catholic. So that's gonna always, I mean, that's not to say that, you know, a Catholic person cannot accept somebody who is queer, but she seemed to be staunchly Catholic.
It reminded me a little bit of, remember Zami? That Catholic syndrome situation. And that's what, yeah, because that's what his mother is, you know what a colonial Caribbean Catholic is, okay? If maybe some of you here have experienced something like that. Okay.
You mentioned that is he from Haiti? I don't recall reading that in the book. That is he of Haitian descent?
I believe I saw that somewhere about him.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
right.
I believe I saw, yeah.
I would make, don't do this, folks, don't do what I'm doing, but I would make the presumption off of the last name Arceneaux that perhaps he is Asian, but I mean Haitian, but let's Google, y'all talking, I'm gonna Google it right now.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that he comes from, not directly from the book, I read somewhere in his early, you know, that he was from like that Haitian descent. I read it somewhere because yes, I looked up his bio too.
Okay.
I found it out.
Cool.
I found it. So it's Haitian, but we're understanding Creole context because actually the last name Arceneaux, working Black family from Louisiana, and he was born. He's from Houston, Texas. You know, so just sort of like that Louisiana influence, perhaps, is also it. Right.
Which again, you know, placing him in the South.
Right. It's weird. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
We make assumptions. I'm sure it's probably just as bad up here, but we make assumptions about the Southerners.
I do want to name that connection that RG made of like authors moving into different. I don't even have a good term for it. Maybe those who work in publishing or those who know would have it, but I just call it different pockets, like throughout their like career. So when you think of a book like Zami, right, Audre Lorde Zami, we get that foundation, and then we later on go on to read other books, right, such as Sister Outsider. One can argue that you could read Sister Outsider, but in order to really know what she's talking about, you should read Zami first. You know what I mean? So just this idea of reading an author's previous work, because I just think it shows where they are in that time, right? Where Arceneaux is in I Can't Date Jesus, even though there are similar thematic ideas, that's an earlier time in Arceneaux's life. Arceneaux then decides to write I Don't Want to Die Poor because now this is the time in Arceneaux's life that they want to share. I read one time, or I heard one time, or I'm plagiarizing this thought. Maybe it was my own, I don't know. But the idea that when you tell a story, or when you're trying to tell a story, the idea is that you get someone from here to here. And what I appreciate, like, meaning you have the person starting off here, and by the end or the middle of the story, you're here. I probably learned that in acting school. What I appreciate most about Arceneaux is that he asks us in the beginning to sort of not join him with a sense of urgency, but he pulls you in here. And wherever he's going in the story, you remain here for the majority of the book. You know what I mean? As opposed to sort of growing your way into whatever he's trying to invite you in. And that's, to me, is like a very, very, very powerful indicator of an amazing writer. Messiness or not. So I think that's really helpful to name. I don't want to forget that tomorrow, Beyond Words Book Club, shout out to Barbara, They're reading The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. And that's pages 114 to 174. The stories include Jael, Instructions for Married Christian Husbands, and When Eddie Levert Comes. Wow, sounds super enticing with those titles, especially that last one. And I actually had a question for y'all about Arceneaux's dating life and sort of whatever themes are happening in this book. If you had to make a statement, right? What is the connection or the correlation? Why is Arceneaux sharing details of his sex life and his dating life with us? And I'm gonna say something beyond the idea of like, oh, I'm telling you these stories because I'm queer, right? Because I mean, he can be queer and not necessarily tell us the intimacy of it, and we can understand and move on, especially because we're naming that there's not one trajectory of this book. Why does Arceneaux feel the need to share that level of intimacy here? And there is no right answer, but obviously I got my teacher hat on. I'm fishing for like an idea here, but there is no right answer. Why is he doing that? Why do we think he's doing it?
I mean, he's real, right? Like Miss Linda had said earlier, he's human. So that's part of his life. So he wants to talk about that. And I don't think he is. It didn't seem to be by the end of the book that he's not in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes he might, like you want to kind of talk about it. You want to talk about your life. And I'm not involved in with anybody. And this is what has happened in my life. And I don't know. I think that was kind of real, because that's real personal.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, together with all of this dying poor, and the financials, I mean, there's this other underlining issue here of his queerness, the difficulty that it is to be queer, the difficulty that queer people have to navigate. So that's also a very important issue that he has going on. But I think that it's kind of lost because there's so many other things that he's talking about. So I personally think, I know Ron mentioned that he can do a book just alone about his dad. I feel like he could do a book just alone about his queerness and about his experience and his evolvedness that happened to that. And I don't know if that's in his first book because I didn't read it, but I'm just throwing it out there just based on, that comment that you made. Yeah.
I also think he's centering queerness in the same way we straight people center, our sexuality, that he is not deferring his queer identity because he's queer. Like if that was a straight writer, he may have mentioned the same things and we would not have really given it much thought because it's in quotes, a straight writer or, heterosexual writer.
Mm-hmm.
I think,
agree.
go ahead.
No, Linda, you got
I was just saying that I think he includes all of the experiences to also keep centered everything that he has to go through. I have this debt, and in addition to having this debt, I have to navigate the world as a Black queer man from the South with parental issues. It's all central to his story. It's like the debt thing is just made even heavier by all of his other issues. And so to leave that out, I mean, would he be struggling as much if he were a straight white guy simply with college? No. So I think he wants the reader to understand everything that he's carrying.
Mm-hmm. That is, y'all are all making great points. And that is my teacher hat when I put it on. That was the point that I was searching for. just naming this idea and bringing it back to all the books that we've read together. Queerness or not, and yes, queer identity, there's an emphasized pressure, right, in order to navigate life and be in all these other things. But what I'm naming is that queerness or not, there is a vulnerability and a shame in sex, right? When we're dating, when we're navigating it, when we're having to share in it with other people. There's a shame and vulnerability also in his relationship with his family. There's a shame and vulnerability also in having to navigate finances and not getting there. So what I want us to understand is that also the stories about sex, yes, he's queer and it's emphasizing that, but it's also just, there's shame in sex. There's vulnerability in sex. There's like extreme pressure to kind of know what you're doing and how to be in that. And that's a subconscious pressure that people navigate through jest or navigate really hard or navigate in community, but we navigate it all the time. And it's not a huge point. He doesn't outright name it and say this is the point, but I think it's brilliant to understand that his use of these personal stories around dating, and so it's very similar to Audrey's device of when in Zami, when she writes about her erotic experiences. And she even goes on to name later on and uses the erotic, right? That like, I wrote this because it's a queer identity, but I also want to diminish the idea that I need to be full of shame. I need to get my body out of that shame. And I think Arceneaux doesn't say I'm writing this so that I could be free of shame, but I think that is also a point. I think when people are able to write about sex in any sort of facet in the explicit, then they're engaging in that like letting go of shame and being able to invite the reader into something greater. So I want us to understand that like, yes, queerness, yes, Blackness, yes, finances, yes, poverty even, but like also just the idea of like being a human and navigating those simple needs that sometimes seem impossible. And because of all of these other pressures, make us feel shitty about ourselves, you know, and then we engage with shitty people. And you know what I mean? Like all of those things are related. So I just want to name that. It's hitting me now.
I'm sorry, Paula.
No, it hit me now. That's all I'm saying. Like I'm just naming that as I'm listening to y'all, it's hitting me now. Like, oh, that is also the point of it all.
And just to follow up on that, one of the things that he mentions early in the book is how gay people are like their dating life and relationship life starts later because they have to deal with the early years of people pushing them towards heterosexuality and being, in quotes, normal before they are, I don't want to speak universally because many young people come out really early now, but you know, there was a time where you couldn't come, even if you wanted to come out, you probably wouldn't come out into your 20s, late teens, 20s. But then that meant that there were all of these years where straight people are dating in high school, maybe before high school, but definitely through high school and into college, where queer people of a time, and not too long ago, couldn't do any of that until they were like really adults, maybe out of the parents' view in quotes, not their literal view, but maybe moving into a different city or state before they could really present themselves as gay to the public.
Right. Not only that parental or familial community pressure you're naming, Ron, I also think that it's also, you know, it's not just the pressure of like, oh, this is what I look like. At any time except for now, if someone were to come out earlier, if someone were to proclaim something other than heterosexuality earlier, even if everyone in your family is down and cool and they love you and it's great, where in society can you look to as a queer person and be like, oh, I'm just going to get married. I'm going to go to college, get married, find this person, have kids, date a doctor, right? Like queer people can't necessarily be in that conversation. So even if your family, it's now, and I mean now, I mean today and yesterday and the day before, that young people, particularly children or folks that are queer, can look into media and go, oh, that's a projected proposed life, you know, but it's not like queer people were also had books or things to show them like, this is, this is how you open a joint bank account in union with your partner. Like there's nothing like that for queer people. So even if I want to say Michael Arceneaux's specific experience is that his parents weren't, very open, and he had to find himself being able to explore himself later on in life. But I want to name that in a hetero society, even now, if your community is with it, but the norm is still not, it's still very difficult to see yourself. You could be out and still not be able to have a sense of what future or anything like that can look like, because we live in a very hetero
Especially if they're Catholic. Remember what religion does to that, especially if they're Catholic.
And in the South,
Yes.
there are all these different things that we pile on. There's this TV show on HBO right now called Somebody Somewhere.
great
If you
show.
get a chance, I'm going to try to post it. And that's a heck of a long link, but it's talking about like this community of queer people in the South, but they're like middle age, they're post high school, kind of on the edge of middle age. They're for the most part, they're just like white. I don't want to call them white trash, but they're white, barely.
They're actually Midwestern though, right? Aren't they from
Are
Kansas?
they okay? Once you leave New York, you're in the South.
No. I think Kansas itself is like a third party character in the show.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah.
That's right. In Kansas, it's in the
Yeah.
Midwest.
Because they talk very, I don't want to do it, but they talk very
Yeah.
Midwestern.
But if you can check out, it's a nice show. It's only 2 episodes in, so.
Yeah, great show.